Imagine being buried alive for something as small as eating during fasting hours. Today, we see people casually breaking fasts with excuses, laughter, and indulgence. But centuries ago, the same act was considered a crime so grave that it invited punishments more terrifying than death itself. This is not just a tale of discipline or faith, it is the story of how fear and control turned a sacred ritual into a weapon. In modern life, forgetting a fast might mean nothing more than guilt or a quiet correction, yet in this forgotten chapter of history, one young girl paid the ultimate price. Her crime was hunger, her punishment was burial. What you are about to hear has been erased from textbooks, hidden from sermons, and silenced in public memory. But history cannot remain buried forever, and tonight we uncover the truth schools never dared to tell. Fasting has always been more than a ritual of hunger. Across civilizations, it stood as a bridge between the mortal and the divine, a test of discipline that separated the faithful from the weak. In the ancient world, fasting was not simply encouraged, it was enforced as the ultimate marker of loyalty to gods, rulers, and community. To eat when others abstained was not just personal weakness, but open rebellion, a declaration that one rejected the laws written not only by men but by the heavens themselves. And rebellion demanded punishment. In the deserts of the Middle East, fasting laws were wrapped tightly in scripture, binding daily life with sacred obligation. Leaders used them as tools to maintain obedience, weaving morality with power. A missed fast was not seen as forgetfulness, it was betrayal. Those who dared break it were branded as sinners, dangerous to the moral fabric of society. Villages whispered that one sinner's indulgence could invite famine, plague, or divine wrath upon everyone. And so, every mouthful stolen in secrecy became a crime against the community. In medieval Europe, fasting carried a similar weight. The church demanded abstinence from meat on holy days, framing it as a test of devotion. A person caught feasting on forbidden meals was not simply shamed, they could be fined, excommunicated, or publicly humiliated in front of their neighbors. Chronicles tell of men whipped in marketplaces, women paraded with food forced into their mouths as mockery. The humiliation was not accidental, it was crafted to remind others that breaking the fast was breaking the sacred order. In the Ottoman courts, sultans enforced Ramadan with ruthless severity. Soldiers patrolled the streets at dusk, watching for smoke rising from homes before the appointed hour. Those who could not resist temptation, travelers, laborers, or even children, were dragged out and punished. Some faced public beatings, others imprisonment, and in extreme cases, execution. The laws were not about hunger, they were about control. They proved who held the authority to define sin and who had the power to decide justice. The cultural significance of fasting stretched far beyond religion. It was tied to honor, masculinity, and obedience. In many societies, young men proved their strength through the endurance of hunger, while women's chastity was measured by their ability to fast silently and without complaint. To falter was not only a personal failure but a stain on family honor. Imagine the pressure. One missed meal could shame your bloodline for generations. A simple bite of bread could turn love into disgrace, turning neighbors into accusers. Contrast this with modern times. Today, fasting is often flexible. People are excused for health reasons, children are spared, travelers given leniency. Even those who falter may find encouragement rather than condemnation. At most, they carry personal guilt or spiritual regret. But the ancient world offered no such mercy. Back then, breaking a fast was equated with treason, a spiritual crime that demanded brutal repayment. Where today's societies promote fasting as a choice, yesterday's rulers enforced it as a sentence. Punishments varied across regions, yet their brutality carried a single message: obedience was survival. Some were flogged until their backs split open. Others were locked away, deprived of food until starvation became their teacher. In some villages, those caught eating were forced to confess publicly, heads shaved in disgrace. The worst punishments, however, were symbolic, meant not only to destroy the body but to instill terror in all who watched. Burial alive was one such fate, transforming the ground itself into a grave of shame. To be swallowed by earth for breaking a fast was the ultimate warning. Hunger is temporary, but defiance is eternal. Historical records, though scarce, give chilling glimpses into these laws. Chroniclers wrote of peasants dragged from fields for chewing grains, of servants executed for sipping water in secret. In Babylonian codes, fasting tied directly to purity, and impurity was a crime punishable by death. In Byzantine law, violations of holy abstinence could lead to branding or mutilation. Every empire had its way of turning hunger into a weapon, and every society molded fear to its advantage. Behind the severity lay political calculation. Rulers understood that controlling food meant controlling people. Hunger was the most primal human weakness, and by sanctifying it, leaders ensured submission. A citizen too afraid to eat was a citizen too afraid to rebel. Thus, fasting laws became instruments of power, cloaked in the name of piety but sharpened with the edge of tyranny. And for the innocent, children, women, the poor, the burden was unbearable. Their bodies became battlegrounds where obedience was tested and punished. In this world, the girl who dared to eat during fasting hours was not seen as a child succumbing to hunger. She was painted as a rebel, a danger to the divine balance, an enemy to her people. To punish her brutally was not considered cruelty, it was considered justice, a necessary cleansing. Society convinced itself that her suffering would protect them from wrath. And so they dug the earth, not to plant seeds of life, but to bury a life that had barely begun. The world of fasting laws was a world of shadows. On the surface, they preached discipline, devotion, and purity. But beneath, they reeked of fear, power, and cruelty. Today, when someone breaks a fast, they may feel guilt or receive a gentle reminder. Back then, a single mistake could cost not only dignity but breath itself. It is in this world, where food was forbidden, hunger sanctified, and punishment merciless, that the story of the buried girl unfolds. Before her name was erased and her memory reduced to a cautionary tale, she was simply a child. A girl who woke each morning to the sound of her mother preparing bread, who laughed with her siblings in the courtyard, who dreamed of small joys that never reached beyond the walls of her village. She did not begin her life as a symbol of sin or defiance. She began it as any other daughter of her time, full of innocence, energy, and trust in the world around her. She was no older than 12. In some records, she is described as younger, perhaps 10. At that age, children carry a strange mix of maturity and fragility. Old enough to understand rules, but still too young to grasp the weight of consequences. Her world was narrow, bounded by fields, a well, and the watchful eyes of elders who measured worth not by kindness but by obedience. For her, every day was repetition. Gather water, help grind grain, clean the floor, and learn by watching her mother's hands shape life from nothing. Her family was not powerful. They were not royalty or scholars. They were ordinary people, bound to the rhythms of harvest and ritual. Her father worked long hours in the fields, returning with dust caked to his skin. Her mother carried the burden of raising children and maintaining a home under constant scrutiny. Poverty did not allow rebellion, survival required submission. Yet even within hardship, the girl found small escapes. She would chase chickens in the yard, draw lines in the dirt with sticks, and watch clouds drift lazily above her. She had a smile that carried warmth in a world that offered little of it. But innocence in such societies was fragile. Girls were not celebrated for their laughter, they were measured by their silence. Her mother often reminded her to sit still, to lower her gaze, to avoid questions that could make elders uncomfortable. She learned early that her voice had little value. Her worth lay in obedience and in her ability to endure hunger, hardship, and silence without complaint. Still, she carried a spark. Her laughter slipped through cracks, her curiosity pushed at the walls of her confined life, and her hunger, for food and for freedom, was always just beneath the surface. Fasting season brought a different rhythm to the household. Days grew longer, meals scarcer, and tempers shorter. Adults whispered of divine reward, but children only felt the ache in their stomachs. The girl tried her best to imitate strength, to keep her lips dry when thirst burned, to hide her trembling when weakness set in. At night, when the family finally gathered to eat, She would devour her portion with the urgency of one who had suffered silently all day. In those moments, food tasted sweeter than any luxury. And yet, she could not stop herself from wondering, why must something as natural as eating become so forbidden? Her struggles did not go unnoticed. Her younger brother teased her when she grew restless. Her older sister scolded her for sneaking glances at the water jar. But the girl was not defiant by nature. She was a child whose body cried louder than her faith could silence. In a time when even adults faltered, expecting a 10-year-old to carry the burden of sanctity was cruel beyond measure. Still, her family pressed expectations upon her, urging discipline, warning that failure would bring shame upon them all. What made her tragedy more haunting was how ordinary her life had been. There was no sign of rebellion, no history of defiance. She fetched water, helped her mother, played with her siblings, and obeyed as best she could. But hunger is relentless. A dry throat cannot be silenced by prayer, and an empty stomach cannot be disciplined into stillness. She would often sneak crumbs when no one watched, not from malice but from desperation. Each stolen bite filled her with both relief and terror, the relief of survival and the terror of being caught. Those who later condemned her did not see the small girl who struggled against weakness. They did not see her as a child learning discipline in a harsh world. They saw her as a danger to their order, a threat to the purity of their rituals. But to understand the injustice, we must remember her first as human. A daughter, a sister, a child with dreams that never had a chance to bloom. She loved to sing softly when she thought no one was listening. A neighbor once remembered her voice drifting from the courtyard, carrying melodies too innocent for the grim silence of the village. She loved animals, often sneaking scraps to stray cats and dogs. She loved stories, fables told by her grandmother at night, tales of heroes and gods that seemed larger than life. And she loved food not greedily, but with the pure joy only a child knows, savoring each grain of rice, each drop of milk, each crumb of bread. This is the girl the world forgot. Before she was judged, before she was condemned, before the earth swallowed her breath, she was simply alive. She was laughter in the courtyard, a helping hand in the kitchen, a set of wide eyes staring curiously at the sky. She was a child learning how to survive in a world too merciless to forgive hunger. To personalize her story is not to soften the horror but to sharpen it. Because once you see her as human, fragile, innocent, ordinary, the punishment that awaits becomes unbearable to imagine. She was not an outcast, not a criminal, not a monster. She was a little girl whose only crime was giving in to hunger. And in the cruel arithmetic of her world, that crime carried the weight of death. As we move forward, remember her not as a faceless sinner but as a daughter who laughed, played, and dreamed. Remember her humanity, because only then can we truly grasp the darkness of what was done to her. The day that sealed her fate began like countless others, but carried within it a shadow she could never escape. The sun rose hot and merciless, beating down on the parched fields and the mud brick homes that lined her village. From the first light, the air was heavy with silence, as though even the birds understood that fasting season demanded stillness. The girl stirred awake, her lips cracked from thirst, her body weak from the long days of hunger that had already passed. She rubbed her eyes and looked around the small room where her siblings still slept, their breaths shallow, their limbs thin from deprivation. The scent of bread lingered faintly in the air from the meal they had eaten before dawn, but that taste was already a distant memory, replaced by the gnawing ache in her stomach. The rules were simple, yet cruel. Nothing must pass her lips until the call at dusk. For adults, the hours were long but manageable. For a child, they were unending. She tried to remind herself that obedience was survival, that patience was strength. Her mother had whispered it into her ears countless times. Endure, and God will reward you. Fail, and shame will follow. But by midday, when the sun reached its cruelest height, those words no longer comforted her. Her head spun, her hands trembled, and her body begged for relief. That day she was sent to fetch water. The well stood at the edge of the village, shaded by a few weary trees that offered no real escape from the heat. As she walked barefoot across the burning ground, her throat tightened. Each step felt heavier than the last. She carried the clay jug with both hands, the vessel seeming larger and heavier with every pace. By the time she reached the well, her lips were so dry she could barely swallow. She lowered the jug into the cool depths, the splash echoing like a cruel temptation. The sound of water filled her ears, crisp and clean, a reminder of the relief denied to her. For a moment she hesitated. She looked around. The path behind her was empty, the trees silent, the village distant. The world seemed to hold its breath as she pulled the jug up, droplets spilling over her small fingers. She lifted it closer. Her heart pounded as though it knew what she was about to do. She could hear her mother's voice in her head, warning her. She could see her father's stern face, his pride in discipline, his scorn for weakness. But above it all, she felt the pain of her body crying out for mercy. Hunger could be ignored, but thirst was different. Thirst burned, it clawed, it suffocated. And so, in a moment that seemed both fleeting and eternal, she raised the jug to her lips. The first drop was like heaven. The cool water slid across her tongue, easing the cracks in her lips, soothing the fire in her throat. She drank quickly, desperately, as though afraid the water itself would vanish. Each swallow brought relief, and with each swallow came guilt. She stopped, gasping, the jug still pressed to her trembling hands. Her heart hammered in her chest. She had done it, broken the fast, shattered the sacred rule. She told herself it was only a sip, that no one would know, that God might forgive a child. But guilt has a way of echoing louder than relief. Unbeknownst to her, eyes were watching. A neighbor boy, older and eager to prove his devotion, had followed her path. He stood at a distance, hidden by trees, but close enough to see her lift the jug. His eyes widened, his mouth twisted with a mix of shock and righteousness. For him, her weakness was an opportunity, a way to elevate himself by exposing her failure. By the time she turned back, her lips wet, he had already run toward the village, his words forming like venom on his tongue. The girl returned with the jug full, unaware of the whispers already spreading. Women gathering in courtyards looked up at the boy breathless with news. Men paused their work, their brows furrowing. Children began to murmur, eyes wide with excitement and fear. By the time she stepped back into her home, a storm was already gathering, a storm she could neither see nor stop. She tried to hide her guilt, placing the jug down and busying herself with chores. But guilt changes a person. It makes every glance feel like judgment, every silence feel like accusation. Her hands shook as she ground grain, her eyes darted nervously when her mother spoke. Did they know? Could they see? Each sound outside made her heart skip, each shadow at the window made her tremble. She wanted to confess, to beg forgiveness, but fear held her tongue. Perhaps, she thought, the world would forget. Perhaps, God would show mercy. But the world was not merciful. By afternoon, whispers had grown into accusations. Neighbors gathered at her door, voices sharp, eyes filled with condemnation. The boy stood among them, pointing, his story painting her as a deliberate sinner, a defiant breaker of sacred law. Her mother's face paled, her father's jaw clenched in shame. The girl stood frozen, unable to speak, her guilt now exposed like a wound. She wanted to cry out, to explain that she was only a child, that thirst had been unbearable. But the crowd was deaf to innocence. To them, her act was rebellion, an insult to God, a threat to their community. The fear in her eyes that day would haunt those who saw it. Wide, shimmering, pleading for mercy she would never receive. She was dragged into the open, her small hands clutching at her mother's clothes, her cries piercing the silence of the village. People gathered, eager to witness judgment, eager to reaffirm their own piety through her suffering. A normal act, drinking water, an instinct as old as life itself, had become a crime so great that it demanded her destruction. That day, a sip of water became her death sentence. A moment of weakness became her legacy. And as the sun sank lower, as dusk approached, the girl who had once been full of laughter now faced the terror of punishment she could not comprehend. What began as an ordinary day in fasting season ended as the beginning of her nightmare. By the time the sun began to dip, her secret was no longer a secret. What had begun as a hushed whisper in the courtyard had grown into a wave of outrage sweeping through the village. Neighbors who once smiled at her became accusers, their tongues sharpened with righteous fury. The boy who had seen her at the well was no longer just a child. He had transformed into a witness, his voice carrying weight far beyond his years. He repeated the story again and again, each retelling twisting her small act of weakness into an unforgivable crime. The village listened, and with each telling, their anger deepened, their resolve hardened. Her father returned from the fields weary, but the sight that met him was worse than exhaustion. A crowd waited outside his home, their eyes burning with demand. Men with furrowed brows, women with whispers, children wide-eyed with excitement. Everyone wanted judgment. He looked to his wife, whose face was pale and broken, but before he could speak, the accusations began. "She drank from the well," cried the boy. "She spat on our sacred law," shouted a man. "She has mocked the fast," another woman hissed. The girl stood trembling, her small hands clenched tightly, her lips quivering. She wanted to deny it, but the water had already betrayed her. Her wet lips, her guilty eyes, her shaking body, they told the story even without words. Her father demanded silence, but the crowd pressed forward, demanding punishment. In a world where obedience was life, her disobedience was seen as poison. The village elders were summoned. These were men who had grown old in devotion, their authority unquestioned, their judgments feared. They gathered in the square, their robes flowing, their faces stern as stone. The girl was dragged before them, her feet scraping against the dust, her cries swallowed by the noise around her. She looked at the faces of her neighbors, once familiar, now filled with condemnation. Her heart pounded as she searched for one sign of mercy, but found none. The trial was swift but not silent. The elders asked the boy to speak again, and he told his tale with pride, embellishing the moment until it seemed like an act of deliberate rebellion. He painted her not as a child, but as a sinner who mocked the fast openly. Other voices joined in, claiming they had seen her drink, or that they had always suspected her weakness. The crowd's memory became distorted, twisting suspicion into certainty, certainty into rage. When it was her turn to speak, her voice faltered. Tears streamed down her face as she whispered that she had been thirsty, that she had not meant to offend, that she was only a child. Her words, fragile and broken, were drowned by shouts. "Excuses," they cried. "Defiance," they roared. In their eyes, her plea was not innocence, it was rebellion. To admit weakness was to insult their strength. To ask forgiveness was to question their judgment. Her mother tried to shield her, stepping forward with trembling hands, but the elders silenced her with a single glare. The father, torn between love and shame, stood frozen. To defend his daughter meant to invite disgrace upon his household. To remain silent meant to betray her. He chose silence, and that silence would echo for generations. The elders deliberated, though the outcome had been decided the moment the whispers began. To them, this was not about a girl or her thirst. This was about the village, about control, about proving that sacred law could not be bent. If one child was allowed to falter, others might follow. And so they declared her guilty, their words final and absolute. Her punishment would not be a slap, nor a scolding, nor even a whipping. No, her punishment would be burial. The crowd gasped, not in horror but in awe. Burial alive was the ultimate sentence, reserved for acts that threatened the very foundation of their world. To bury her was to bury the shame she had brought, to bury the danger of rebellion, to bury the reminder that even hunger could not excuse disobedience. It was a punishment both symbolic and terrifying, meant not only to silence her but to warn every other child, every other woman, every other weak heart in the village. Her cries grew louder as the words sank in. She clutched at her mother, begging, pleading, but hands tore her away. The crowd, once neighbors, became executioners. They looked upon her not with compassion but with the satisfaction of righteousness. Some muttered prayers, others spat curses, and a few looked away, unable to meet her gaze but unwilling to speak against the judgment. The trial of shame was more than a legal act. It was a performance. A performance meant to reinforce obedience, to remind everyone of the power the elders held, of the fragility of mercy, of the weight of law. The girl's innocence no longer mattered. Her youth no longer mattered. Her humanity no longer mattered. She had become a symbol, and symbols could not be forgiven. They had to be destroyed. As dusk approached, the crowd dispersed to prepare for the sentence. Some went to dig, others to gather. The village square emptied slowly, but the echoes of judgment lingered in the air. The girl remained, her face streaked with tears, her voice hoarse from crying. She looked to her parents, but their silence told her what she already knew: no one would save her. In that moment, she was no longer a child of the village. She was an outcast, a warning, a sacrifice to the altar of law. The trial had stripped her of everything: her innocence, her dignity, her hope. All that remained was fear, growing stronger as the earth was prepared to receive her. That day, the girl who only wanted water became something far more dangerous: a lesson. A lesson carved not into parchment, but into the soil that would soon cover her small, trembling body. The decision had been made. The girl's cries still echoed in the square when the elders pronounced the sentence with chilling finality: she would be buried alive. No hesitation, no consideration of her youth, no acknowledgement of her humanity, only the heavy certainty of law, delivered like a blade to the heart. To the villagers, this punishment was not cruelty, it was necessity. To them, her death would cleanse the community of shame, silence the whispers of disobedience, and protect them from divine wrath. But beneath their pious resolve was fear, the fear that one act of weakness could unravel the fabric of their world. The process began immediately. Men were ordered to dig a pit just beyond the village boundary, where the earth was dry and unyielding. The sound of shovels striking soil carried through the night, each thud a reminder of the fate awaiting her. Women gathered stones, not for mercy but for ritual. Some whispered prayers for forgiveness, others repeated words of condemnation. The children, wide-eyed and restless, clung to their mothers, half terrified and half thrilled by the drama unfolding before them. For them, this was both spectacle and warning. The girl was kept under watch, her wrists bound, her face streaked with tears. She had cried until no tears remained, her voice hoarse from pleading for mercy. But the elders showed no compassion. They sat in silence, their faces like carved stone, waiting for the moment when the sentence would be carried out. To them, compassion was weakness, and weakness was the disease they sought to eradicate. As the pit grew deeper, the symbolism of burial began to take shape. To bury alive was not just to kill, it was to erase. It was to return the sinner to the earth before her time, to silence her disobedience in the most permanent way possible. The act carried with it the weight of purification. Just as the fast cleansed the soul, the burial cleansed the community. In their eyes, this was not a death, it was a sacrifice. When the pit was finally complete, the villagers gathered at its edge. The sun had nearly set, casting long shadows that stretched like fingers across the ground. Torches flickered, their flames trembling in the evening breeze. The girl was dragged forward, her small body stumbling, her feet leaving trails in the dust. She clung to her mother one last time, but her mother's arms were pulled away by the villagers. Her father stood apart, silent, his face etched with shame and resignation. He could not look at her. The elders recited their judgment one final time, their voices carrying across the silent crowd. They spoke of law, of purity, of obedience. They declared that her act of drinking water was not the weakness of a child but the defiance of a sinner. Their words stripped her of innocence, transforming her into an enemy of the sacred order. By the time they finished, the girl was no longer seen as a daughter or a sister. She was seen as a symbol that needed to be destroyed. She begged for her life. She promised never to falter again. She swore she would endure hunger and thirst without complaint. Her words poured out in desperation, but they fell on ears deafened by righteousness. To the villagers, her pleas were proof of guilt. To forgive her now would mean admitting weakness, and weakness was a luxury they could not afford. The executioners stepped forward, ordinary men chosen by the elders to carry out the act. Their faces were grim, their hands steady, though some eyes flickered with unease. They lifted her into the pit, her small body trembling, her cries rising in the still air. She clutched at the dirt walls, trying to climb out, but the hands that once held her in play now held her down. She called out to her parents, to God, to anyone who would listen. But silence answered her. The first shovelful of dirt fell, striking her shoulder. She screamed. Another fell, covering her feet. Panic filled her eyes as the earth began to rise around her. She clawed at the soil, trying to push it away, but the weight only grew heavier. Each shovel was deliberate, each movement a ritual of obedience. The crowd watched, some with solemn expressions, others with satisfaction. To them, this was justice in action, the restoration of balance. Her cries grew fainter as the dirt reached her chest. Her small hands stretched upward, desperate for rescue, but no one moved. Her mother wept silently, held back by strong arms. Her father stood rigid, his face turned away. The elders recited prayers, their words blending with her fading voice. When the earth finally covered her face, silence fell. The screams ended, replaced by the dull thud of soil being packed tight. The pit was filled, the ground smoothed as though she had never existed. The villagers stepped back, their duty complete. Some crossed themselves, others bowed their heads, but none dared question what had been done. To them, the girl's death was not a tragedy, it was a necessity. They told themselves it was mercy, that her soul would find peace, that her punishment would protect them all. But beneath the surface, unease lingered. For though the earth had swallowed her body, her cries still echoed in their minds. The sentence of burial alive was more than an act of punishment. It was a demonstration of power, a reminder that law was stronger than blood, that obedience was worth more than life. The girl was gone, but her death ensured that no one would dare follow her path. Hunger would be endured, thirst would be suffered, and silence would be maintained. Her burial was not the end of her story, it was the beginning of her legacy as a warning, etched not in stone or scripture, but in the soil itself. The moment the earth closed over her face, time itself seemed to falter. For those standing above, the burial was an act of justice concluded. For the girl beneath, it was the beginning of a nightmare no child should ever endure. Darkness engulfed her, heavy and suffocating. The weight of the soil pressed down on her chest, crushing each breath into ragged gasps. The once cool earth that she had played in as a child now became her shroud, her prison, her executioner. At first she screamed. Her cries pierced the night, muffled yet unmistakable. The villagers shifted uneasily, hearing her voice echo from beneath the ground. But the elders urged them to remain still. "Do not listen," they said. "She is paying for her defiance." Yet how could they not? Every plea for mercy struck their hearts, every desperate wail reminded them she was not a sinner but a child. Still, none dared to intervene. To show compassion now was to question the law itself, and questioning the law was a path few were brave enough to walk. Her small hands clawed upward, scraping at the soil. Fingernails cracked and bled as she fought against the impossible weight. Each handful of dirt she managed to push aside collapsed back over her face, filling her mouth, choking her lungs. She coughed, gagged, spat out mud, but the earth was relentless. Panic surged through her veins, her body thrashing wildly, desperate for light, for air, for life. Above, some villagers clenched their fists, unable to look away. Others prayed louder, drowning her cries with holy words, hoping the sound of their devotion would cover the reality beneath their feet. The horror of burial alive was not only in death, it was in the slow, merciless progression toward it. Unlike the swiftness of a blade or the finality of a fall, this punishment stretched each moment into eternity. She felt the air grow thinner, her chest heaving as oxygen slipped away. Her heart pounded, racing faster than ever before, yet growing weaker with every second. She tried to scream again, but only dirt filled her mouth. She tried to move, but the soil pressed tighter, locking her in a coffin without wood or nails, only earth. Her mind drifted between terror and memory. In flashes, she saw her mother's face, the courtyard where she had once played, the sound of laughter that had filled her home. For a moment, she imagined she was back at the well, sipping cool water, feeling relief wash through her. But the illusion shattered as her lungs burned, reminding her that there was no relief here, only suffocation. Her body convulsed, each movement weaker than the last. Above, the crowd began to disperse. Some could not bear the sound any longer, slipping away into the shadows of their homes. Others stayed, their expressions grim, forcing themselves to watch until the end. The elders remained steadfast, their faces unflinching, their voices steady as they repeated prayers. They told themselves that her cries were not suffering but purification, her struggle not horror but atonement. In this way, they silenced the whispers of conscience that threatened to rise. But for the girl, there was no comfort, no justification. Her body betrayed her, her lungs desperate for air that no longer existed. She coughed again, choking, her chest shuddering violently. Her eyes stung as soil pressed against them, the darkness absolute. Every instinct screamed to survive, but the earth gave no mercy. Her movements slowed, her strength fading, until only faint twitches remained. Finally, even those ceased, her small body still beneath the weight of judgment. The silence that followed was unbearable. The villagers shifted uneasily, ears ringing with the absence of sound. The cries had stopped, but the memory of them would linger forever. The elders declared the punishment complete, their voices calm, as though a simple task had been finished. They reminded the people that justice had been served, that their community was now purified, that the wrath of heaven had been averted. But even as they spoke, unease remained. For though the girl's voice was silenced, her suffering echoed in the hearts of those who had witnessed it. The horror of her burial was not only in the act itself, but in the way it transformed the community. Children who watched would never forget the sound of her muffled screams. Mothers who wept silently would forever carry the guilt of not speaking out. Fathers who turned away would be haunted by their cowardice. And those who lifted shovels would live with the memory of dirt striking her body, their hands forever stained by the soil of her grave. The ground was smoothed, the pit erased, as though nothing had ever happened. Yet the earth carried her story, holding it in silence beneath the feet of those who had condemned her. Each time the villagers passed that place, unease gnawed at them. They told themselves it was righteousness, but deep down, they knew it was something darker. They had not defended faith, they had destroyed innocence. The horror of the burial was not just that a girl died. It was that a community chose silence over mercy, obedience over compassion, fear over love. They convinced themselves they had acted justly, but justice without humanity is only cruelty dressed in holy words. That night, they buried more than a child. They buried their conscience, their compassion, and their ability to see innocence for what it was. And so, her cries became a ghost that lingered, not in sound but in memory. The girl who drank water when she should not have, the girl who was judged as a sinner, the girl who was buried alive. Her story did not end with the soil. It lived on in the unease of those who watched, in the whispered fears of children, in the nightmares of mothers who turned away. The burial silenced her body, but it immortalized her suffering, etching it forever into the dark history of humanity. When the last shovelful of earth was pressed flat, the crowd slowly dissolved into silence. The ritual was complete, but the echoes of what they had witnessed refused to fade. People walked home in heavy stillness, their torches flickering like guilty eyes in the night. Some muttered prayers for forgiveness, others clung tightly to their children, and a few avoided each other's gaze altogether. Yet outwardly, the community had reached agreement. Justice had been done. The girl was gone, and with her, the stain of disobedience. But inside her home, the world had shattered. Her mother collapsed to the ground, her body convulsing with sobs that no prayer could quiet. She had watched her daughter beg for mercy and had been powerless to stop it. Now, silence filled the rooms where laughter once lived. Each object, a half-mended cloth, a cracked cup, a discarded toy, became a reminder of the child who would never return. Guilt gnawed at her heart. She had been told to let go, to surrender her daughter to the law, but her soul screamed that she had betrayed the very blood she brought into the world. Her father carried a different burden. He did not weep, he did not speak. He sat alone, his face like stone, but inside he was fractured. his silence during the trial, his refusal to defend her, these haunted him like chains he could not break. He told himself he had no choice, that to speak out would have brought ruin upon them all. Yet he knew that his silence had been cowardice. He would never escape the memory of her eyes, wide and pleading, as the villagers pulled her away. For the rest of his life, he would be a man torn between pride in obedience and shame in betrayal. Her siblings were too young to understand fully, but children feel absence keenly. They wandered the house in confusion, calling her name, waiting for her to return from the courtyard. When days passed and her place at the table remained empty, fear settled in their hearts. They whispered questions their parents could not answer. Where did she go? Why isn't she coming back? In time, they would be told that she had sinned, that her fate was her own fault. But deep down, they carried memories of her laughter, her kindness, her humanity. That contradiction would shape them forever. The larger community faced its own contradictions. Publicly, they celebrated their righteousness. Sermons praised the punishment, declaring it proof of their devotion. Elders reminded everyone that the village had been protected from divine wrath by their actions. Yet behind closed doors, unease spread. Mothers worried for their daughters. Fathers questioned the severity of the law. Children woke screaming in the night, haunted by muffled cries beneath the earth. No one spoke openly, but the silence was heavy with doubt. Some villagers defended the act fiercely. It was necessary, they said. Disobedience must be crushed before it spreads. To them, the girl was not a child but a danger. They claimed her weakness would have invited disaster upon them all. In their minds, her death was not murder but sacrifice. Others, however, could not quiet their guilt. They remembered her smile, her playful voice, her small hands. They avoided the place of her burial, as though the earth itself accused them of complicity. The aftermath reached beyond the village. News spread to neighboring communities, carried by travelers and merchants. Some praised the village for its strictness, admiring their devotion. Others whispered that the act was barbaric, a stain on faith itself. The story became both a warning and a weapon, told and retold until the girl herself disappeared beneath layers of rumor and judgment. To outsiders, she was no longer a person. She was a symbol, stripped of humanity. For her family, however, the pain never faded. Every fasting season reopened the wound. Each time hunger gnawed at their stomachs, they remembered her cries. Each time the call to prayer echoed, they remembered her pleading eyes. Her absence became a presence, haunting every meal, every prayer, every silence. Her mother's tears carved lines into her face, her father's silence hardened into bitterness, and her siblings grew under the shadow of a sister who was both erased and unforgettable. Society moved forward as societies always do, but the scar remained. The burial had been meant to purify, to erase disobedience, yet instead it planted seeds of fear and doubt. Parents whispered warnings to their children with new urgency: endure, or you will share her fate. Children fasted with trembling lips, not out of devotion but out of terror. The girl's death became a lesson repeated endlessly, her suffering transformed into a tool of control. The irony was cruel. She had been buried to silence rebellion, yet her death spoke louder than her life ever could. She had been erased to protect purity, yet her absence revealed the impurity of blind obedience. She had been condemned as a sinner, yet her memory became a quiet reminder of innocence destroyed by law. In the aftermath, the village told itself it had acted in righteousness. But beneath the surface, the truth lingered. They had buried not only a girl but their own humanity. And though time would dull the sound of her cries, it could never erase the echo of what they had done. The story of the girl's burial should have shaken the foundations of belief, but instead it slipped into shadows, covered by silence and denial. Her death, brutal and unnecessary, was not recorded in public chronicles as an act of cruelty. Instead, it was reframed, softened, or erased altogether. What remained were fragments, whispers in oral traditions, scattered references in forgotten manuscripts, and hints in the margins of religious commentary. These fragments, though fragile, reveal a chilling truth. Hers was not an isolated tragedy. In many societies, records of punishments for breaking fasting laws exist, but they are often couched in language that hides their brutality. Chronicles describe discipline rather than torture, purification rather than execution. When burial is mentioned, it is framed as symbolic, a return of impurity to the earth. The horror of being buried alive, the screams of a child suffocating under dirt, is absent. Historians suspect this was intentional. Communities wanted to remember their devotion, not their cruelty. To preserve the appearance of holiness, they obscured the reality of violence. Religious texts, too, carry traces. Some passages warn of harsh penalties for those who break fasts deliberately, painting them as threats to divine order. Over time, interpreters debated whether these warnings were metaphorical or literal. Yet in villages where law and faith blurred, metaphor became mandate, and mandate became punishment. The girl's story, repeated in whispers, was transformed into cautionary lore, a nameless figure sacrificed to prove obedience. Her humanity was stripped away in the retelling, replaced by her role as an example. What is most disturbing is how quickly such stories vanish from mainstream memory. History prefers heroes and victories, not children buried alive for drinking water. Records of kings, battles, and dynasties survive for centuries, but the suffering of ordinary people, especially women and children, fades into obscurity. The girl's burial was not convenient to remember. It exposed the darker side of devotion, the cruelty hidden beneath piety. So, scribes and elders chose silence, erasing her from written history. Yet silence cannot fully erase truth. Oral traditions, passed down in whispers, often preserve what records omit. In some regions, mothers warned their children with tales of a girl punished for drinking. The details shifted with each generation. Some said she was noble-born, others that she was a peasant. Some claimed she was buried in a pit, others in a stone tomb. But the essence remained. She was a child destroyed by law. These variations show how her story spread beyond one community, carried like a ghost across cultures. Archaeological hints also surface. Excavations of ancient sites have revealed shallow graves, unusual for the time, containing small bodies with no signs of disease or natural death. Some scholars speculate these may be evidence of ritual punishment, though proof is elusive. Still, the possibility lingers. How many girls like her were buried, their names forgotten, their deaths hidden under the guise of devotion? Each unmarked grave may conceal a story as tragic as hers. The suppression of such histories was not accidental, it served power. Leaders and elders had no interest in preserving records that showed their cruelty. To admit that a child had been killed for breaking a fast was to admit that fear, not faith, governed their authority. Better to erase the girl than to question the system. Better to bury her memory alongside her body. In this way, history was not only written by the victors, it was cleansed by them. But traces survive in unexpected places. A traveler's diary, centuries old, speaks of visiting a village where a child was punished for defiling sacred time. A faded manuscript references the girl who ate before the hour of dusk and was silenced in earth. Local songs, half forgotten, carry verses that speak of hunger, of punishment, of a mother's weeping. These fragments, though small, pierce the veil of silence. They remind us that beneath the grand narratives of kings and empires lie stories of ordinary suffering. Modern historians face the challenge of piecing these fragments together. The difficulty lies not only in scarce evidence but in willful omission. To reconstruct the truth means to challenge centuries of sanitization, to question the narratives that portray past societies as purely righteous. For every record preserved, countless others were destroyed or altered. What remains are echoes, faint but persistent, demanding recognition. The girl's story illustrates a larger truth. History is not neutral. It is curated, shaped, manipulated. The cruelty of her death was inconvenient, so it was suppressed. Yet suppression itself is evidence of guilt. If her punishment had truly been righteous, there would have been no need to hide it. The silence of the record speaks louder than words. It testifies to the shame that her death carried, even for those who claimed it was just. And so we are left with fragments, each carrying weight far beyond its words. A single sentence in a manuscript can open a window to unimaginable suffering. A local folktale can preserve what official histories sought to erase. Together, these fragments form a mosaic, not complete, but powerful. They remind us that beneath the surface of devotion lay cruelty, and beneath the silence of records lay screams buried in earth. The suppressed history of the girl's burial is not just about her. It is about countless others whose stories were erased, children silenced, women condemned, innocents destroyed in the name of purity. Her tragedy stands as a symbol for all the forgotten, the nameless, the erased. Each time her story resurfaces, even in fragments, it challenges the narrative of holiness. It forces us to confront the truth that devotion, when twisted into law, can become cruelty. The danger of suppression is not only forgetting the past but repeating it. When societies hide their cruelties, they create illusions of righteousness that justify future violence. Remembering the girl means more than honoring her. It means breaking the cycle of silence. It means refusing to let the earth swallow truth along with the innocent. Her burial may not be written in the grand histories, but it survives in whispers, in fragments, in shadows. And perhaps that is fitting, for shadows are cast by light, and the very act of suppressing her story proves its power. They tried to bury her twice, once in the ground and once in history. Yet here she is, her voice faint but unforgotten, reminding us that no amount of silence can truly erase suffering. Her story closes where silence begins, but its echoes cannot be contained. The girl who was buried alive for breaking fasting rules is gone, her body consumed by earth, her name erased by records, her innocence denied by law. Yet what remains is more powerful than her absence. It is the reminder that cruelty often hides behind the mask of righteousness, that the harshest punishments are carried out not by monsters, but by ordinary people convinced they are serving something greater. When we look at history, we prefer heroes and victories, legends of courage and faith. But history is also full of shadows. Stories like hers, stories of children whose weakness was treated as rebellion, whose humanity was stripped away for the sake of obedience. These shadows unsettle us because they reveal an uncomfortable truth. Societies often use faith and law not to protect the innocent but to control them. Her burial was not about devotion to God. It was about power, fear, and conformity. The horror lies in how ordinary it seemed to those who carried it out. The elders recited prayers as they condemned her. Neighbors told themselves they were purifying their village. Parents stayed silent, believing they had no choice. None of them thought themselves cruel. They believed they were righteous. That is the most terrifying lesson of her story, that cruelty does not always look like hatred. Sometimes it looks like obedience. Sometimes it looks like silence. Contrast her world with ours. Today, fasting is often flexible, softened by compassion. Those unable to endure are excused, encouraged, or comforted. A child who falters may be reminded gently, not condemned. Yet her story reminds us how fragile that compassion can be. It shows us that when fear outweighs mercy, when law outweighs love, even the smallest mistake can invite the gravest punishment. It forces us to ask, how close are we even now to repeating the same cruelty under different names? Her burial is not just an event of the past, it is a mirror. It reflects the dangers of blind obedience, the cost of silence, the ease with which communities sacrifice individuals to preserve order. Every time we hear of a child punished harshly, of a woman silenced, of a community turning away from injustice, we are hearing her cries again. Her story may belong to a forgotten village, but its lesson belongs to all of humanity. What makes her tragedy unforgettable is not only the injustice of her death but the ordinariness of her life. She was not a queen or a rebel. She was a daughter who fetched water, a sister who laughed in courtyards, a child who dreamed of small joys. Her humanity makes her punishment unbearable to contemplate. If such innocence could be buried alive, then no one is safe when law turns against compassion. The suppressed records, the whispers, the folklore, they all testify to the same truth. People tried to bury her twice. Once in the ground, and once in memory. yet her story survived. And in surviving, it condemns not only her community but every generation that hides cruelty behind sanctity. She is a ghost that history could not silence, a voice that still asks, "Will you remember me, or will you bury me again?" As this tale ends, it leaves us with questions rather than comfort. What do we do with stories like hers? Do we dismiss them as relics of a brutal past? Or do we confront the ways cruelty still cloaks itself in law, still hides behind obedience, still silences the weak? To honor her memory is to refuse silence. To remember her is to promise that innocence will not again be treated as rebellion. And so, let her story haunt us. Let it disturb our comfort, break our illusions, and remind us of the dangers of forgetting. The girl who was buried for breaking fasting rules is gone, but her cries live on. They live in the doubts of those who watched, in the guilt of her parents, in the unease of her community, and now in us. We cannot undo her fate, but we can refuse to let it be erased. This is the dark reflection her story demands, that history is not only about kings and empires but about children who suffered in silence. That true devotion is not proven by punishment but by compassion. That every act of cruelty dressed as righteousness leaves scars that no amount of silence can heal. She was only a girl. She was only thirsty. And yet she was buried alive. That truth alone is enough to strip away centuries of excuses, enough to remind us that when law loses sight of humanity, it ceases to be justice. It becomes horror. Her story is finished. But its warning has only just begun.